If you've never driven a truck for a living, you'd probably think the hardest part is staying awake. It isn't. The hardest part is how quickly everything turns into a routine. You stop for fuel, grab a coffee, use the restroom, do a quick walk around, then you're back on the road. After a while, you stop paying attention to the little things because you've done them 1,000 times. That's exactly why this happened. I was hauling auto parts from San Antonio up to Oklahoma. Nothing expensive. Nothing that would have made me think anyone would be interested in my load. It had been an easy day. Traffic wasn't bad, the weather was clear, and I was actually ahead of schedule for once. Around 8 that night, I pulled into a busy truck stop to fill up. Every diesel pump was occupied. Drivers were walking in and out of the store, talking on their phones, grabbing food, cleaning windshields. It was just another stop. I fueled the truck, locked the doors, and went inside to pay. I picked up a large coffee, a couple of beef jerky packs, and 2 energy drinks. The line was longer than usual. I couldn't have been inside for more than 6 or 7 minutes. When I got back, everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. Nothing seemed out of place. I climbed in and kept driving. About an hour later, I reached over for my sunglasses. They weren't where I always keep them. I searched the dashboard, the cup holders, and even the floor. Nothing. I figured I'd accidentally packed them away. A little while later, I noticed my driver's seat felt different. Not by much. Just far enough back that I had to pull myself a little closer to the steering wheel. I laughed and blamed it on being tired. Around midnight, I stopped at a rest area to get some sleep. Before climbing into the sleeper, I opened the small cooler I'd packed that morning. One of the energy drinks was gone. I just stared at it. I clearly remembered buying 2. I'd only had 1. I even checked the trash bag, thinking maybe I'd forgotten. It wasn't there. For the first time that night, something didn't feel right. The next morning I finished the drive and delivered the load without any problems. I probably would have forgotten the whole thing if my safety manager hadn't called me later that afternoon. He asked if my inward-facing dash camera had been working. I told him it should have been. He said the system had flagged a motion event while the truck was parked. I figured maybe it caught someone walking past. He sent me the clip. I watched it sitting in my cab. The camera showed me climbing down from the truck and walking toward the store. About 30 seconds later, a man wearing a gray hoodie walked up to the passenger side. He looked around once, opened the door, and climbed inside. He never rushed. He acted like he knew exactly what he was doing. Then, he just sat there for almost 6 minutes. He didn't dig through my bags. He didn't touch the GPS. He didn't steal my wallet. He barely moved at all. Every few seconds he'd glance toward the windshield, like he was waiting for something. Then the video ended. I waited for the next clip. There wasn't one. I watched it again. Same result. The recording showed him getting into my truck. It never showed him getting back out. I called my safety manager and asked if the file was corrupted. He checked. No, he said. That's the only motion event. I didn't understand. If he was still inside when I came back, how did I miss him? The police reviewed the footage. They couldn't explain it either. One officer thought maybe the camera had failed. Another guessed the man slipped out while I was loading my coffee and never triggered the sensor again. Maybe that's exactly what happened. I hope it is. But there's one detail I still can't explain. When I watched myself climb back into the truck, I was carrying 1 coffee, 1 bag of jerky, and only 1 energy drink. I know I bought 2. I have the receipt to prove it, which means someone else drank the missing one. Whether he got out before I came back, or sometime after I pulled onto the highway, is something I've tried very hard to stop thinking about. These days, whenever I fuel up, I still lock my truck. I still do my walk around. The only difference is, before I pull away, I always check the passenger seat. Then I check it one more time. Most truck drivers will tell you the hardest deliveries aren't the ones that take all day. They're the ones that go too smoothly. This happened during a run from Laredo, Texas to Oklahoma City. I'd already made that trip more times than I could count. It was mostly I-35 the whole way, and by then I knew every truck stop I'd pass before I even left Texas. The load wasn't anything unusual. Boxed kitchen appliances. Heavy, but nothing expensive enough to make me worry. I left Laredo just after noon and spent the night outside Waco before finishing the drive the next morning. Around 8:15 a.m., my dispatcher texted me. The customer had changed unloading docks because of construction. That wasn't unusual. Warehouses change dock assignments all the time. A minute later, another message came through with the updated address. It was only a few miles from the original destination. I plugged it into my GPS and kept driving. About 20 minutes later, I pulled into a large industrial park on the south side of Oklahoma City. The warehouse looked busy. There were trailers backed into loading docks, forklifts moving around, employees wearing reflective vests. Everything looked exactly like every other distribution center I'd ever been to. A security guard stepped out of a small booth before I even rolled my window down. He smiled. "Morning. You're the appliance load from Texas, right?" That immediately made me relax. He already knew where I was coming from. He checked a clipboard, pointed me toward Dock 7, and waved me through. Inside the yard, another employee met me before I even finished backing into the dock. He helped guide me in, perfectly, like he'd done it 1,000 times. While they started unloading, another guy walked over carrying 2 coffees. He handed me one and said, "Long drive?" I laughed and thanked him. We talked for a few minutes about traffic through Dallas and how construction on I-35 never seemed to end. Everything felt normal. Maybe too normal. The unloading took less than half an hour. They handed me signed paperwork with company stamps on it. One of the guys even joked, "You're lucky. Most drivers sit here for 3 hours." I pulled out, thinking it had been one of the easiest deliveries of the month. About 90 minutes later, my phone rang. It was dispatch. "How far are you from the customer?" I laughed. "I already unloaded." There was a long pause. "No, you didn't." "Yeah, about an hour and a half ago." Another silence. Then he asked me to read the address on my paperwork. I did. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Finally, he spoke. "That's not our customer's address." I felt my stomach drop. I turned the truck around immediately and headed back. The industrial park was still there. The streets were the same. The building was exactly where I remembered it. But something was wrong. The gate was closed. There weren't any trailers, no forklifts, no employees, no security booth. Just an empty warehouse with faded paint and weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. I parked on the shoulder and walked to the gate. A man from the building next door noticed me. He asked if I needed something. I told him I'd made a delivery there that morning. He stared at me. "You sure?" I nodded. He looked back at the warehouse. "That place has been empty for over a year." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. The police eventually got involved. They told me organized cargo theft crews sometimes rent equipment, print temporary signs, wear matching safety vests, and even use fake paperwork convincing enough to fool experienced drivers. They don't need the building forever. They only need it for one truck. Mine. The company recovered almost none of the shipment. Whoever planned it disappeared before anyone realized the load was gone. I still think about one thing from that morning. The security guard knew exactly where I'd come from before I ever said a word. At the time, I took that as proof I was in the right place. Now I realize it meant they'd been waiting for me all along. I've never been the kind of driver who believes in bad luck. Most things on the road have an explanation. If you keep seeing the same truck, it's probably headed in the same direction. If you stop at the same truck stops every week, you're bound to recognize a few faces. That's what I kept telling myself. I drive a regular route between Amarillo, Texas and Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's not exciting, but after 5 years of doing it, I know every fuel stop, every decent diner, and every place worth avoiding after dark. One Tuesday morning, I stopped at a Love's just west of Tucumcari. While I was filling up, another driver walked past me. He nodded and said, "Morning." I nodded back, nothing unusual. About 3 hours later, I stopped again to grab lunch. Same guy, same gray hoodie, same black baseball cap. He was sitting alone near the window. I noticed him because he looked up the second I walked in. We made eye contact for maybe a second, then I forgot about it. The following week, I saw him again. Different truck stop, different town, same clothes. This time he smiled and said, "You're making good time today." That caught me off guard. I laughed and asked if we'd met before. He shrugged. "I've seen you around." That made sense. Trucking is a small world. You run into the same people all the time. A month went by. Every Tuesday, I'd see him somewhere along my route. Sometimes he was getting coffee, sometimes standing outside talking on the phone, sometimes fueling a pickup truck instead of a semi. Always alone, always calm. I started recognizing him before he recognized me. One afternoon I stopped earlier than usual because I was getting tired. A truck stop I'd never used before. As I walked toward the entrance, there he was, leaning against the ice machine. He smiled. "Didn't expect to see you here." I stopped walking. I had never stopped there before, not once. I asked him how he knew my route. He laughed. "Lucky guess." Then he got into his pickup and drove away. That night I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I mentioned it to another driver while we were waiting to unload. He didn't laugh. Instead, he asked me a question. "Do you haul the same kind of freight every week?" I told him I usually carried electronics or appliances. He nodded. Then he said something I wish I'd heard months earlier. Some cargo theft crews spend weeks learning a driver's routine. I thought he was exaggerating. Until the following Tuesday. I left Amarillo 2 hours earlier than normal. I skipped my usual breakfast stop. I even took a different fuel stop just to see what would happen. Around lunchtime, I pulled into a truck stop outside Santa Rosa. Guess who was already there? Same pickup, same hoodie. He wasn't surprised to see me. He walked right past my truck. This time he didn't smile. He quietly said, "Thought you weren't coming." Then he kept walking. I called the highway patrol before I even started the engine. An officer met me 20 miles down the road. They stopped the pickup a little later. Inside were 3 men. Maps, binoculars, several fake delivery badges, and a notebook. The officer showed me 1 page before they took it as evidence. Across the top, my truck number. Underneath it, dates, fuel stops, break times, even notes about how long I usually stayed inside each truck stop. Whoever they were, they hadn't chosen me that day. They'd chosen me weeks earlier. I still drive through Texas and New Mexico. I still stop for fuel. I still wave at other drivers. But whenever someone I don't know greets me like we're old friends, I always wonder one thing. How long have they been watching me? I don't usually tell this story because, even now, it sounds made up. But every part of it started with something completely ordinary. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I'd just finished delivering a refrigerated load outside Kansas City. Dispatch didn't have another load ready, so I had almost 6 hours to kill before my next pickup. I grabbed lunch, parked behind a truck stop, took a shower, and spent most of the afternoon watching videos on my phone. Around 6, my dispatcher finally called. "Where are you?" I told him I was still in Kansas. He went quiet. Then he said, "That's impossible." I laughed. "What do you mean?" He told me another dispatcher had just received a complaint about my truck. Apparently, I'd almost sideswiped a car near Springfield, Missouri. The problem was, Springfield was over 3 hours away. I told him somebody must have read the truck number wrong. He agreed, at least at first. The next morning, I picked up my next load and headed east. About an hour into the drive, another call came in. This time it wasn't dispatch. It was our safety department. A woman asked me if I'd stopped at a way station overnight. I said no. She asked if I was sure. I was. Then she told me something that made my stomach turn. A truck with my company name, my truck number, and my DOT information had gone through a way station in another state. At almost the exact same time I was buying dinner in Kansas. At first, everyone assumed it was a paperwork mistake. Until 2 days later, a customer called asking why I'd never delivered a shipment. The delivery receipt had my printed name on it, my employee ID, and what looked almost exactly like my signature. It wasn't mine. Someone had copied it. The company started digging. Within a week, they found 2 more deliveries completed under my identity. Same truck number, same paperwork, different truck. Whoever they weren't stealing random freight. They'd built a truck that looked almost identical to mine. Same company decals, same unit number, even the same reflective markings. Drivers who passed them on the highway would have sworn it was me. For nearly 3 weeks, someone else had been driving across the Midwest pretending to be me. The police eventually recovered the fake truck abandoned outside St. Louis. It had been stripped almost completely clean. No fingerprints, no paperwork, nothing useful. The only thing left inside was a notebook. Most of the pages had been torn out, except one. On it were 5 names. 4 had been crossed out. Mine wasn't. I asked the detective what that meant. He looked at the page for a long time before closing the notebook. Then he said, "I honestly hope it was just a checklist. That was 2 years ago. My company changed my truck number after that. They replaced the decals, issued me a new ID. Even now, every time another driver waves at me on the interstate, I sometimes catch myself wondering, are they waving at me? Or the guy who spent weeks pretending to be me?" One thing I've learned after almost 10 years on the road is that dispatch makes mistakes. Wrong trailer numbers, wrong paperwork, wrong appointments. It happens. So when my dispatcher called me around 4 in the morning and said my delivery location had changed, I didn't think twice about it. I was hauling restaurant equipment from St. Louis down to Little Rock. Nothing expensive, nothing that should have made the trip memorable. He texted me the new address while I was stopped for coffee outside Rolla, Missouri. I looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, plugged it into my GPS, and got back on I-44. That was it. No warning bells, no bad feeling, just another day at work. Around 9 that morning, I pulled into an industrial area I'd never been to before. The place looked normal. Not busy, not abandoned, just quiet. There was a chain link fence around the property, a few trailers parked near the building, and one older guy wearing a reflective vest sweeping leaves away from one of the loading docks. As soon as he saw my truck, he pointed toward Dock 3, like he'd been expecting me. I rolled down my window. "You here for the kitchen equipment?" "Yeah." "You're right on time." That was enough for me. I backed into the dock, set the brakes, and handed the paperwork to the guy waiting outside. He barely looked at it, just smiled and said, "We'll take it from here." It wasn't unusual for drivers to stay in the cab during unloading, so that's exactly what I did. I called my wife, scrolled through my phone, finished the coffee I'd bought earlier. Maybe 25 minutes later, the same guy knocked on my door. "All set." He handed me the paperwork, stamped, signed. Everything looked legitimate. I wished him a good day and pulled away. About an hour later, my phone rang. Dispatch. "How far out are you?" "I already delivered." Silence. "What do you mean?" "I dropped it off almost an hour ago." Another long pause. Then he asked me to read the address on the paperwork. I did. He interrupted me halfway through. "That's not the address we sent." I pulled onto the shoulder and checked the text message. The address on my phone was different. Completely different. I figured maybe I'd typed it into the GPS wrong, except I hadn't typed anything. I tapped the link Dispatch sent me. Dispatch emailed me another copy of the original message. Same timestamp, same phone number, different address. By the time I got back to the industrial park, the place looked nothing like it had that morning. The gate was locked. The trailers were gone. There wasn't a single vehicle in the lot. Even the loading dock doors were chained shut. I got out and walked over to the fence. That's when a man from the business next door walked up beside me. "You looking for somebody?" "I made a delivery here this morning." He frowned. "No, you didn't." "I was here, around 9. He looked through the fence for a second before answering. "I've worked next door for almost 6 years." He pointed at the building. "Nobody's rented that warehouse in over 8 months." I actually laughed. I thought he was messing with me. He wasn't. The police got involved later that afternoon. They checked traffic cameras, security cameras, and even my electronic logs. Everything proved I'd been there. Everything, except one thing. Nobody could find a single camera showing another vehicle entering or leaving that warehouse that morning. Not a forklift, not a pickup. Nothing. The detective handling the case asked me one question before I left. "When you backed into the dock, did you actually see anyone unload your trailer?" I opened my mouth to answer. Then I realized I hadn't. I'd seen 2 men. I'd handed over the paperwork. I'd heard a forklift running somewhere inside. But I'd never actually watched a single box come off my trailer. That question has bothered me ever since. Because I honestly don't know if anyone unloaded that freight, or if I simply drove away believing they had. These days, whenever I make a delivery somewhere new, I don't care how busy I am. I don't care if someone's waiting on me. I watch the trailer doors open. Every single time. Because once, I delivered an entire load to someone who, according to everyone else, was never there. One thing I've noticed about trucking is that you end up building routines without even realizing it. You stop at the same places, order the same food, park in the same rows. After a few years, you don't even think about it anymore. I was running a load from Denver down to Phoenix, Nothing unusual. Paper products, light load, easy drive. The first morning, I stopped outside Colorado Springs to top off my tanks and grab breakfast. The place was busy, so I ended up standing in line for almost 10 minutes. While I was waiting for my coffee, a man standing near the window looked over at me. He smiled and said, "Long way to Arizona?" I smiled back. "Yeah." That was the whole conversation. He didn't seem strange, just another traveler. I didn't think about him again. A few hours later, I stopped outside Trinidad for fuel. As I was walking toward the store, I noticed the same man sitting on a bench near the entrance. Same gray jacket, same black ball cap. He looked up as I walked by. "Thought you'd be here sooner." I laughed. "I got stuck behind construction." He nodded. "I figured." I remember thinking it was a weird thing to say. Still, it wasn't enough to bother me. People talk. That's all it was. The next morning, I crossed into New Mexico. Normally, I'd stop in Santa Fe for coffee, but traffic had been light and I wasn't tired, so I kept driving another hour. I ended up pulling into a little truck stop I'd never used before. There couldn't have been more than 20 parking spaces. I figured there was no chance I'd see that guy again. As soon as I walked inside, the cashier smiled. "You just missed your friend." I stopped. "My friend?" "The man in the gray jacket." She pointed toward the front windows. "He was just asking if you'd made it yet." I looked outside. The parking lot was almost empty. No gray jacket, no pickup, no semi, nobody. I didn't mention it to anyone. It sounded too stupid. The rest of the trip was normal. I delivered the load in Phoenix and headed back north 2 days later. Honestly, I'd almost forgotten about the whole thing. Until Amarillo. I parked for the night at a crowded truck stop just off I-40. I ate dinner, called my wife, and was walking back to my truck when someone behind me said, "Changing your route this week?" I turned around. It was him. Same jacket, same calm smile. I finally asked the question that had been bothering me. "Have we met before?" He shook his head. "No." "Then how do you keep ending up everywhere I stop?" He looked at me for a second before answering. "You stop where most drivers stop." That actually made sense. It was the first answer he'd given that sounded completely normal. I got back in my truck and drove away the next morning. A week later, I mentioned the whole thing to another driver while we were waiting to unload. He laughed. Then he asked me what the guy looked like. I described him. Gray jacket, black cap, maybe 50 years old, short beard. The other driver didn't laugh anymore. He looked down at his coffee for a few seconds. Then he quietly said, "I've talked to him too." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He told me almost the exact same story. Different states, different route, same man. Always friendly, always waiting, always seeming to know where he'd stop next. I asked him if he ever found out who the guy was. He shrugged. "No. Maybe we're all just stopping at the same places." That should have made me feel better. Instead, it somehow made it worse. A couple of months have passed since then. I still run through Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. I still stop for fuel. I still grab coffee. Every now and then, I'll catch myself looking around the parking lot before I get out of the truck. I haven't seen him again. At least, I don't think I have. But every once in a while, a cashier will hand me my receipt and say something that still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Your friend was here earlier." The strange part is, they never seem to know his name. Neither do I.